Welcome everyone to today's webinar, How to Work Alone, a toolkit for thriving as a hybrid, remote and freelance worker. My name's Ben and I am the Alumni Engagement Manager here at the King's Alumni Office. This is the first session of the How To event series for the academic year. This series supports students and recent graduates to understand issues affecting the workplace and to help you feel well prepared to pursue, choose and succeed in your careers. Today's session looks at how approaching work and study has changed over recent years with an increasing amount of solo working through hybrid and remote delivery. We'll look at how this impacts individuals and what you can be doing to continue to thrive in your work and your studies. This will take form of a conversation with our speaker, who we'll introduce in a second, followed by an opportunity to ask your own questions. Please post any questions you have in the Q&A function below, and a member of the event team will sort these into themes so we can then cover as many relevant topics as possible. If anyone happens to be joining us from the YouTube live stream, you can also join us from there as well. The event's due to last 1 hour, and like I mentioned, there will be a recording available after the session. So I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker, Rebecca Seal. Rebecca graduated from King's in 2005 with a Master's in International Peace and Security and has since found success as a freelance podcaster, journalist and author. In 2020, Rebecca published How to Work Alone and Not Lose Your Mind. In this book, Rebecca talks about her experiences working working solo throughout her freelance career and the teaching we can all use in our own lives. Rebecca, did you want to just introduce yourself, a bit about your career journey, what you did at King's and what you've been up to since?
Sure. Well, first, thanks very much for having me. It's lovely to be back, albeit remotely at King's. As you said, yes, I did a master's in international peace and security, which I have to say I have not used greatly in my career, although I very much enjoyed doing it. Soon after finishing at King's, I started my first proper job in journalism at The Observer, and I worked there for 6 years. And that was after quite a few internships and kind of freelance gigs beforehand. And yeah, so I worked there for 6 years and went freelance about 15, maybe 16 years ago now. I had been an assistant editor on one of the magazines at The Observer, and I really, really wanted to write and kind of work in a more self-directed way. And I was lucky enough to be offered voluntary redundancy. So that was the context in which it was feasible for me to go freelance. And then I just put my head down and worked really, really hard without thinking about my well-being or my kind of career trajectory or anything much at all for about 6 or 7 years. And at that point, I more or less hit a position of burnout, which was when the idea for my book Solo came about. But because of the burnout and also because of having a couple of kids, it took me quite a few years longer to get to a point of writing it. I wrote most of Solo in 2019 and it came out in 2020. I then developed it into a podcast series called The Solo Collective, which started in 2021 and ran for 3 seasons and continued the conversations that I'd started to have in the book about how to kind of safeguard your mental health and your general well-being whilst working on your own, which is, has a unique set of challenges associated with it. And obviously from 2020 onwards was a much larger group of people than the group I initially thought I was writing for. And then subsequent to that, I wrote another book called Be Bad Better, which came out last January. And that's another kind of book about mental health and well-being, not so relevant to today's discussion. And I was lucky enough for both those books to allow me to broaden out my journalism career and write more about health and well-being and mental health and the provision of things like mental health service and the social drivers of health inequality, that kind of thing. So that's been a really amazing privilege actually for that work to come full circle, because that's very much where I started wanting to work. But I managed to get a niche in the food writing industry. So that the magazine I worked on at The Observer was actually the food magazine. And I also write recipe books. So about 50% of what I do is writing recipe books and doing food journalism. In fact, I wrote all these. Here's my little set, which I didn't plan at all. I actually randomly am sitting in my kitchen. Yeah, so I now have a sort of dual pronged career, which is both fun and interesting and extremely challenging and hard to navigate. But I can talk more about the challenges and the pitfalls and the swerves and random cul-de-sacs that I've gone up in my career, if you want me to.
Amazing, thank you for that. It sounds like it's been a quite a journey, but I think that's very much relatable to a lot of people who are sort of exploring their recent careers. There's so many different changes you can go, and I think you really finish uni not knowing where you're going to be in 5, 10, 15 years time. So it's pretty cool to see the kind of places you end up.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I'm always keen to emphasize when I do talks like this, or events like this, and I talk about my career, is that it's really easy to look at the headlines, as it were, of a career like mine and think, oh, that looks really straightforward and really easy. But I spent a huge amount of the time that I was working at the Observer and even freelancing in my late 20s. So I was at the Observer in my early 20s, and then in my late 20s, I went freelance. And I spent a huge amount of that time really questioning whether I was doing the right kind of work and whether it was going to lead to anything that I felt was significant. And, you know, I was writing about a very lovely topic, food, but it didn't feel necessarily that the work that I was doing had kind of real heft and weight, which was something that had felt really important to me. And I mean, that's not actually true looking back at the work that I was doing, but I nonetheless, I felt really kind of complicated. I had really complicated feelings about the work that I was doing. And I often described it as kind of living somebody else's dream career because I was aware that it was really successful. And by lots of metrics, it was kind of visibly a really cool thing to be doing. And I was going to lots of events and lots of parties and
Yeah.
openings and all those kinds of things. And it looked very swish from the outside. But inside, I was really kind of conflicted about it. I grew up in a family where my parents are social workers. You know, it felt really complicated, and I didn't have, obviously, because I was quite young, and you can't do this without hindsight. I didn't have the perspective to see that actually all of these things were building blocks to a career that I now have the opportunity to do work that does feel useful and significant to me, according to my own set of values. Like, I also think that's a part of the conversation about all of this is about working out your own metrics for success and what a successful life as a whole looks like, rather than simply, you know, a career progression, the amount of money you're earning. I mean, when I first went freelance, the only way for me to understand whether I was successful or not, because I hadn't had a conversation with myself about what success was, the only way to measure that was how much money I was earning. And so I
Mhm.
hyper focused on that, which meant I worked extremely long hours. I neglected my friends, my relationships, my parents, you know. I just said yes to everything because I didn't have another framework to assess whether things were going well for me or not. So I just took the only framework that was available. And like I say, I just worked really hard for 6 years and I didn't reflect. I didn't think about the choices that I was making. And I think that's understandable for the first couple of years of a career. But I think doing it for 6 years is too long. And that's very much why I wrote solo, was because I wanted to set out the mistakes that I had made and that I'd seen a lot of other people make, and kind of help people through maybe not making the same mistakes and not overworking and not sort of sacrificing themselves on the altar of their jobs, and thinking about their lives in a more sort of in the round holistic way,
Yeah.
and making choices based on that rather than get rich quick.
Absolutely. So, with that in mind, I guess it's time to get into the meat of the conversation about solo
Mm-hmm.
working and what all of that means. So, do you want to tell us a little bit from your perspective about how you feel like the workplace has changed over the past few years and what challenges you've seen come out of an increasingly solo working style?
Yeah, so I think what's been really fascinating to see is the way in which so many people have transitioned from a very traditional office environment into either working some of the time at home on their own or all of the time at home on their own. And I think some organizations have been really good at accommodating for that. And in some stages of life and for some individuals, it's been super successful. But I think what I've learned, which I was surprised to discover, is that it doesn't work for everybody. me, and that it's not necessarily the right thing for every stage of life. I think in your early career, it can be quite complicated and difficult to be not in an office environment. In certain jobs, like everything I say should be caveated with, this depends very much on the person you are and the way that your brain works. So none of these are blanket statements, but in general, there are groups for whom this stuff works better. I'm a parent, working flexibly really suits me. I can't really imagine going back into a traditional office environment now because I have so many other responsibilities and kind of moving parts to my life. But that wouldn't have been the case when I was at the beginning of my career. So I think if you're moving into a career or an organization where remote first is kind of how they want to operate, then you need to make sure that you're creating a network of support around yourself, that you'll have mentoring opportunities, training opportunities, all of those kinds of things. You should choose an organization which takes those things seriously, because you're going to need to kind of backfill the traditional structures that an office would have given you for learning and development, and make sure those are there. If you're just given a laptop and told to get on with it, that's not really good enough. That's not really what an organization should be doing to the people at the beginning of their careers, because that doesn't give you an opportunity to learn. And it also doesn't give you an opportunity to think about how you should do that work at home. And I think a lot of the stuff that I learned when I was writing solo can be applied to being a student as well. And I wish I'd known more of it, wherever possible, not working in your bedroom. Now, if you're at the beginning of your career, that's really hard to do because the chances are you're living in a fairly small and enclosed space. So you then need to start thinking about, and some of this is your responsibility and some of it's your organization's responsibility. Like, is there somewhere else that I could work? Do I need to make choices where I can work in a library or in a cafe? And obviously, if you've got a job that involves loads of calls, that's really hard to do. But then if you have to work at home and you have to work in your bedroom, what are the steps that you can take to safeguard your mental health, to create a boundary, both in kind of time and space and mentally, from your work and your kind of home and living environment? So one of the techniques that I learned, which sounds very sort of too simple to be true, but it's consistently been the thing which has come up over and over again in workshops that I've given, as a very, people have come back to me a few weeks later and said, I can't believe it's made such a difference, it's amazing, is either having a box into which all of your work stuff can go at the end of your period of working time, or a cupboard, or just a sheet over your work, so that you are creating like a physical boundary that your brain can then use to say, this is over, this is the transitional period. I mean, there's lots of stuff that came up in the at the beginning of the pandemic about people doing like fake commutes where they would leave the house and walk around the block and then go upstairs to their office and start working that way. And I mean, if that works for you, then that's absolutely brilliant, but I'm not sure people necessarily need to go that far. It's also about noticing the markers that you create in your own life to say, this is where I'm beginning to work and this is where I'm finishing work. Because those are the two bits I think that people find most difficult, is either starting work or finishing work, or both, if you're me, which I find challenging. And so doing things ritualistically can be incredibly helpful. So one of the techniques that I know a lot of people use is to burn a candle, and the candle burns down whilst you're working, and at the end of the working period of time you blow the candle out. So it's there's a huge range of things that you could do to create those boundaries, but I think those are there are a few of the things that we can do to kind of help us not allow our work to bleed endlessly into all corners and areas of our lives, like physically, by taking over your bed or taking over the whole of your kitchen or whatever, but also mentally, because then you're saying, no, these pockets of time, these belong to me. This isn't for work. My organization can't take this, or my freelance business can't take this. This stuff is mine, and I'm transitioning into that period of the day. So that can be really useful. I had no idea how powerful that would be until I started talking to people about it. And I genuinely would say that pretty much every time I've done one of these, someone has got in touch with me afterwards and said, that was life-changing, which is kind of amazing.
And one thing that's already come up so many times in this conversation is how individual it is and how important it is to kind of like take ownership of your own space and your own approach to doing it, and understanding that not one solution is going to fit everyone.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the things that I wanted to do throughout Solo as a book, and also with the Solo Collective as a podcast. I don't necessarily have specific answers. I what I didn't do was ask any questions. And so the thing that I always want to do with these conversations is say, have you asked yourself, like, what is it you want from your life? What kind of work do you want to do? Where do you want to do it? Like, where do you want to live? Where do you want to be? Like, what kind of people do you want to be around? Do you want to be around people at all? Do you prefer not being around people? Like, I'm obviously very happy in my own company, and I'm not a team player. Like, I find teams quite stressful. I was a gymnast as a child. I did not do team sports. Like, you know I'm an extrovert, but I'm not a teamy sort of a person. So this sort of work where I'm tangentially part of lots of teams, but I don't have to deal with any office politics, this really suits me. But I spent 6 years working in a big organization that I found really stressful and really overwhelming, and it was loud, and people ate crisps really close by, and like it was bright. There was a lot of overhead lighting. There were no plants. There was no kind of softness. It was grey and silver and white and harsh, and as all office environments are. And actually, on reflection, that doesn't suit me at all. Like that doesn't work for my personality. And I think even if I'd decided to go into the job knowing that stuff, I would have gone into the job, but I would have known what the effects were, and I would have done what I could to mitigate the impact on myself. So I think it's about saying, who are you as an individual? How do you work well? What things do you find challenging? And some of this is stuff that we have to learn as we work, but the thing that I think we're not very good at teaching people to do, particularly in the UK, when it comes to moving from studying to work, or at least I never experienced, and I hope it's better now, is to do those conversations and to have them repeatedly throughout the course of your career. Like, I'm due another one now. I've got it in my to-do list. Like, sit down and do a kind of 1 year, 5 year, 10 year sort of scoping review. And think about what things are important and what wants to come next, and what's working and what's not. It's really important to do those for ourselves in the same way that an organization would do that with their KPIs or whatever. But I don't know that we put huge primacy on work as part of our identities in the culture that we are currently in, like huge importance, but we don't actually have many conversations about what work and why and for whom, and how does it make us feel, and what the space that we do it in makes us feel, or any of those things. And so I think the great joy of remote work and freelancing is that you can have those conversations, and you can arrange your office to feel or look how you want it to be. But so many of us just replicate what we had in an office environment, or what we've seen in an office environment, instead of thinking, wait, I could just sit in an armchair, or I could just lie on the floor, or whatever works for your personal body and setup. So that's part of what I want to encourage. It's not necessarily saying, oh yeah, I've got loads of answers. It's often about saying, right, let's have a conversation about who you are.
Do you have any particular things that you found changed when you started solo working, in terms of either your sense of self and kind of how that changed between working for an organization and working for yourself? But also, like you said, did you suddenly start working on the floor when you worked from home and had all that freedom?
I mean, no, because I was a lunatic at the beginning. I just went away and I kind of completely replicated what I'd had before. So I got a white desk and a silver computer and an ugly chair, and and I put it in a white room, and I made it very stripped back. And I was like, this is work. This is work. You don't have any, they what do they call it? I've completely forgotten the name of when you an enriched environment. I didn't enrich my environment at all. I just like focus. And actually, it turns out that the data shows that our brains really don't do well in very stripped back, unenriched environments, and that you're more creative and more intellectually stimulated when you've got plants and books and pictures, particularly if you can see greenery, or you've got pictures of greenery, or pictures of water, things like that. Like our brains respond really positively to those things. You don't need to have strip lighting overhead and a chrome chair. So it took me a long time to kind of learn those lessons and realize that actually I could have an environment that was very soft and gentle and exactly what I wanted it to be. So now I work at a wooden desk, and it's a rise and fall, so I can stand up if I want to. I've got a soft chair that I can sit in if I want to. Granted, I absolutely never do, but it's there. It makes me feel cozy. And I sit on a fleece, so it's really warm, and I can see trees. I've made sure that my desk is right by the window, so that my circadian rhythms aren't being impacted by sitting in gloom. So that, that's another really important thing. And again, this is something that comes up quite often in when I've done talks like this one, is that people really benefit from getting daylight bulbs if you're working in a gloomy environment, if it's not possible to move your desk near to a wall, if you near to a window, if you can put a daylight bulb in your desk light, and just expose yourself to as much daylight like light as you can during the day, and then obviously turn it off at dusk, then you can really offset the impact of kind of artificial lighting on your body and your circadian rhythms. So again, that's proved to be quite a worthwhile piece of advice. But yeah, what else did I learn? I mean, I went through a really weird transition where I felt like I'd lost my sense of identity because I'd left my job as an assistant editor at the Observer, and I didn't really know who I was. And I would say it's probably taken me until now to get to a point where I don't super hyper over identify with my job. And where I wouldn't describe my job as a passion any longer. I would say that it's a thing I do, and it's how I earn money, and I like it, and I feel very lucky to do so many things that are interesting. But I have kind of separated that sort of sense of identity from the work that I do, and I think that's really healthy. I feel much better having done that, because you're much less kind of vulnerable to this sort of ebb and flow of how a career goes, and the degree to which you don't really have control over what might happen next in your career. So yeah, I learned that. I learned to be much more flexible, and I learned how resilient I am. I think and we're all resilient, but I think by learning about resilience in order to write the book, I learned how to recognize my own resilience. And when you recognize your own resilience and you remind yourself of how resilient you've been in other contexts and how resilient you've got the capacity to be, therefore, in this one, that makes it easier to access that resilience. And it makes you believe in yourself more effectively, like, to be corny about it. So so that was an important lesson. But I mean, there are thousands I could
Lots and
list.
lots.
I mean, I will if you want me to.
One thing you spoke about particularly that I thought was worth exploring more was kind of that idea of creating boundaries when working remotely. And you've spoken about, covering up your space or moving your laptop out of the way, or making sure you're working in a designated area. Is there anything further within that kind of realm of learnings that you have found particularly helpful, or any other things on top of, boundary setting, creating a space that works for you, that has really positively impacted your personal mental health since moving to solo working?
I mean, one of the things that I did that was profoundly useful was moving my desk out of my home. So I spend a very small amount of money, about £45 a week, renting a desk outside the house, which I actually started doing during the pandemic, because I run a photography studio with my husband, but that was closed, obviously, during lockdown. And I had a book to write, so I just went and worked in there. It's literally 25 meters away from where I live, and it was quite revelatory to discover just what such a short distance could do. After I'd been working from home by that point for about 10 years, so I thought I had a really good setup. Like, I had my own room and I could shut the door and, all of that. But in the end, the washing and the washing up and all of those things were still there. So that's been really, really valuable. And I would recommend it to anybody who can possibly afford it. I also think it's a really valuable thing for organizations to do, is to buy subscriptions to things like, not necessarily WeWork, but WeWork type environments, so that people can spend a day of their remote week in an environment with other humans, because that's really important. I think that was another part of what I learned, was that I write a lot about the curse of convenience. Like, convenience culture is all well and good up to a point, but we also have created systems for ourselves where we never need to leave the house. And actually, if you're working remotely, that's extremely negative. So there's a really interesting study about the mental health benefits of making small talk with in this case, it was a barista, but it could be with anybody. So it turned out that there are huge positive mental health benefits if you just have a few words in your day of an exchange. This was looking at people who work by themselves. A few words in your day that you exchange that can be very shallow, very, very flimsy social social connections, but it turns out that it makes you feel rooted in your community. It gives you a rhythm in your day. It makes you feel seen, and it makes you feel like you've got some kind of sense of belonging, and it's actually incredibly powerful. Obviously, if you're at home and you're never going to the post office to buy stamps because you always buy your stamps online, and you do all your deliveries and pickups from the doorstep, you're never really going to be leaving the house and making those kind of shallow social but very important connections with people who live in your area, or work in the businesses around you. And I think that was critical for me to learn, because I spent a huge chunk of time, particularly before I had kids and had no reason to leave the house, where I'd literally just get up, not do anything, just get up and work in my pajamas, and then then get dressed, and then do another like 10 hours of work, and then have dinner with my then boyfriend, now husband, and then get up and do it all again. And we would talk about work well into the night. And so we really reached a crisis point with it. And we now have a set of rules where you're not allowed to talk about work after 8:30. You're not allowed to talk about work before breakfast. You're not allowed to talk about work at the weekend. You have to have a really good reason. We call it playing a card. You have to have a really good reason to let work bleed into those areas. But we needed to make really strict rules of ourselves. And again, that depends on the kind of individual that you are. But I think for many people who work by themselves, I think rules are actually really important. Like, I leave the house once a day. I make sure I make conversation with somebody who isn't just my partner. I make eye contact with somebody. Like, it sounds as though they're absolutely tiny things, but it's so easy not to do it. And when I talk to freelancers in the run up to writing solo, those were the exact things that people struggled with, like that and not eating the entire contents of the fridge. It was figuring out how to create like a network and a community around themselves when they weren't like physically required to make one. Because humans are kind of, we're great, but we're kind of lazy. So if we can get away with not doing those things, then often we won't. And convenience culture has only encouraged that attitude. So again, I think it's thinking like, what do I need? People. I do need people. So how can I get people in my life when I'm working in this weird, unstructured way?
And it's amazing that such tiny little changes can add up to making such a big difference over a long
Yeah.
period of time as well.
Yeah. It's really profound. You were asking about boundaries. I'm just trying to think if there are other things. I think creating, often for some people, not everyone, creating a routine that is akin to the kind of routine that you would have if you were leaving to go to an office. Not the fake commute necessarily, but the kind of like, I start work by 10, or 12, or whenever, or I finish work at 8 p.m. or whatever your rhythm is. My ideal writing time is 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. But because I have children, I never ever get that time. But knowing that stuff, like watching yourself and how you work, and seeing which bits of the day are best for you to be creative and which bits of the day are best for you to do functional stuff. Like, I always send my invoices in the morning. I always do the stationery ordering in the morning, because at that point I'm don't really care. Whereas by about 2 o'clock, I'm kind of ready to write a piece or to work on a chapter. But again, that's about looking inwards and saying, who am I, and where do I function, and how do I function best? And again, I'm not sure we teach people to do that really, as much as would be helpful, particularly now that we're asking so many people to be self-directed.
I think you really raise an important point about what a significant benefit increasing amounts of flexible working is introduced, and that acceptance that people work in different ways, and people have certain times of day when things work better for them. And I think having that ability to shape your own work around what works best for you makes a huge difference. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I love it when I see at the bottom of somebody's email, my working hours are flexible. Please don't feel you need to reply to my email when I send it. I just think that's brilliant. That reflects such a good change in our working culture. But it's not uniform, and it's not everywhere yet. There are huge sectors, finance and banking being a good case in point, where that just isn't. It's not a given at all. You might find it in a few organizations, but it's not considered a kind of viable way of working. And I don't know whether it will be. I think the preponderance of men at the top make that kind of thing quite difficult as well. Maybe it will change. over time, but the sort of the rich white man at the top of the tree makes it it can make it a little bit more difficult for those kinds of changes to come through. But yeah, there are loads of groups, you know, anyone with caring responsibilities, anybody with long-term health problems, mental health difficulties, all of those things can really be alleviated by being able to work flexibly or remotely. And, you know, that can only be a good thing, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing you spoke about a little bit already is kind of the building of networks and the sense of how do you kind of create your own organization, I guess. And
Mm.
obviously, you've managed to really thrive professionally and find success in a field without some of those things that come from working for an organization, such as networks, clear direction, a clear mission. Do you have any other particular tools that you've used to help you kind of manage that and maybe build your own?
Yeah, so I think you have to be really proactive about those things if they're things that matter to you. Obviously, there will be people who are more on the introverted side for whom having a big network of people would be shattering and, you know, not isn't necessary. So again, not a blanket statement, but I think for many people who work by themselves, creating a network is really important. But I think what we misunderstand is it doesn't necessarily have to be a network in the sense of like going to a horrible reception and drinking warm wine out of a plastic cup and feeling really awkward. And the people that you create your network with don't necessarily have to be people that work in your field. So I share my desk space with somebody who works in education. There's somebody else, there's an artist in the same set of desks, and they're probably the two most important people in my kind of career development stuff now, but they don't do anything like what I do, and they have no understanding really of the context in which I work. Like, publishing industry is very specific and quite sort of esoteric in some ways, but that doesn't matter. They don't need to. What I need is people to say to, oh my God, I can't believe this editor's done the same thing that they did again. Oh my God, it's driving me crazy. Or I haven't been paid. I haven't been paid. Why haven't I been paid? You know, I don't need advice on how to, you know, write an article or whatever. I can find somebody to do that if I need. What I need is support emotionally when things are complicated or difficult, and I also need somebody who isn't my partner to be like, woohoo, you got published, look at you know, I love your new book cover, or whatever it may be. So you need somebody who's going to be able to celebrate your successes. So finding somebody who can do that could be someone who's in your network of friends already. It could be somebody else who freelances. Like, we have to actively seek out the cheerleaders, and, you know, and cheerlead them as well. It's reciprocal. And kind of be honest about the fact that that's what we're doing. You know, do you want to like cheerlead each other? Like, you're doing a similar thing to me. Like, should we work together to get through this thing? Because it's really quite hard working by yourself, isn't it? Like, have that conversation. And I've had those conversations. And people are always like, yeah, that'd be amazing. Like, I'm really lonely too, you know, yeah. And so you can kind of organically create a group of people that are your supporters and your cheerleaders. I even know somebody, a very senior woman in she's like a consultant for massive organizations, and and has written loads of books, and she's really, you know, she's brilliant. Margaret Heffernan is her name. I was blanking on it for a sec. She's done TED Talks and stuff, and she has what she calls like her informal board of directors, or a non-exec board or something like that, where it's just a group of friends, and she gets them to meet once every 6 months and sit down with her and talk about her career, like specifically only her career. Like 5 or 6 people who all, you know, meet up and sit around a boardroom table, and she's like, right, this is what I've done, this is, you know, these are my metrics, this is how much I've earned, I've traveled too much, I've traveled too little, I want to do more of this, I want to do, you know, whatever it may be. And these are people that she's just collected in her life and said, would you support me in this way? And they're like, yeah, cool, yeah, of course. So I think people are more open to that kind of thing. Like, the people around you will discover are more open to that kind of thing than you might expect. And I do think it's important as well to emphasize that you shouldn't and can't rely on a partner for all of that. If your partner's freelance, they're going to be knackered by trying to manage, or remote, they're going to be tired out by trying to manage all the extra stuff that comes with being freelance or remote. And if they're not freelance or remote and never have been, then they won't understand necessarily, however empathetic they may be. So I think it's about finding other people who are having similar experiences to you elsewhere in your life, not necessarily to do with work, and like gathering them and holding them close. and you know, creating a reciprocal relationship with that person or with that group of people, so that you can kind of mutually thrive. That has been really, really important to me,
Yeah.
definitely.
You made a really interesting point there about how you felt personally that the networks were really about, hyping you up and making you feel, like you weren't alone, but you felt like for your own learning and stuff, you felt happy to do quite a lot of that practical stuff independently.
Mm.
Did you find when you were earlier on in the process of adjusting that was trickier? And did you have any particular methods of learning from other people that you found particularly helpful? I'm just thinking of people who like maybe work in the organization remotely and still have other team members they want to learn from, but aren't necessarily sat next to them every single day and want to kind
Yeah.
of keep up that learning.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, from a learning point of view, I think it's got to be active. If your organization isn't providing you with a mentor as a given, for example, and some do, then I think, I mean, I am asked quite frequently to informally mentor people who are earlier in their publishing or journalism career. And I'm always delighted to help. Like, it's very flattering. And I like the idea of paying it forward. In the sense that, you know, I relied on other people further on in their careers a huge amount early in mine. And I, you know, very specifically would ask people like, I'd like to learn from you. Can I learn from you? Like, can we go for coffee, or can I buy you lunch? Or, you know, can I ask you all these questions about how you navigate this sort of situation, and how, you know, what do you do then? And, you know, should I do this course or should I do that course? Or do I need to do any courses at all, whatever it may be? And that's quite like a brave move. You do have to be quite forthright. But I don't think I've ever met anyone who's like, no, go away. Like, everyone's like, oh, thanks very
Oh,
much. Yes, I
nice.
do know a lot. You're quite right. Um, you know, so I think if you can ask it in a way which is polite and nice and kind and flattering, then people are very unlikely to say, no, I don't want to. So that was my main way of learning from other people. I mean, I'm also in a lucky position in that, you know, my job is words, and so it's very easy to just read read what other people have done. So I probably had to do less of it than some people might. But I think just like constantly having a conversation, you know, even if it's like online, it doesn't, you know, the biggest network that I'm part of is called the God, it's got such a silly name now. It's changed so many times. The number one freelance creative ladies agency or something. Anyway, it was like started off as a riff on that book title, but and then they changed it loads of times. So it's got like 6,000 members, and it's all freelance women who vaguely work in the creative or kind of media industries. And it's like game-changingly brilliant as a network to be part of. So it doesn't, these networks don't have to be in real life. Like, some do. It's important to have some real life networks, but you know, there are also brilliant informal ones that you can find online that allow you to ask questions that you don't know anyone else. You know, does anybody have a PR contact for the Boots press office? You know, it's that kind of thing. Or like, I haven't been paid for 12 weeks. Is it okay to add statutory invoicing, a statutory interest onto my invoice? Like, has anyone gone through the small claims court? Like, that's a repeated question that's asked all the time in this group. You know, you don't need to know somebody face to face in order to ask those sort of technical questions. So it's about finding a blend, I think, of different communities, like a small real life community, and then maybe some bigger online communities that can be supportive to whatever kind of work that you're doing. But you just have to be quite proactive. And I would recommend being proactive before you get really lonely and miserable, because that's the worst time to try. as I discovered, like I was so unhappy 6 or 7 years into freelancing and so isolated that finding the energy to do the things that I now know are vital to my own and many people's well-being was almost impossible. And probably took like a year for me to really grasp that I had to do. So again, that's part of the work that I do now, is like trying to grab people early and say, just put these bedrock things in whatever career you're going into, wherever you're planning on working. Put the foundational stuff in first, so that you don't get so lonely and so sort of disenfranchised from the work that you're doing that you just feel burned out and want to give up and run away.
Absolutely. There's a few questions coming in the chat, so do keep them coming. I'm going to ask one more of my own before we move on to a Q&A session. And I just want to kind of look forwards, really. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on how do you see the workplace changing going forwards, but then also how can individuals and organizations themselves respond to these changes to make the most of them, continue to support employees whilst they're working increasingly flexibly.
I mean, I think it's highly dependent on the individual organization. I think I think that the excuse me, I think that the pressure to increase opportunities for flexible working is only growing. The campaign for flexible working from some people like the influencer Mother Pucker and people like that, like there's huge pressure growing to create policies and legislation which will enshrine better rights to flexible working, which is a very, very good thing. But it's always going to be highly dependent on how an organization, well, what the attitude of the organization is to flexible working. And there's still kind of interesting data coming out about, you know, what the perceptions are among senior management of people who want to work flexibly and, you know, all of that stuff. So it's very hard to make predictions. I think things are going to get better. I think flexible working will become more widespread, but there is already, as everybody will already know, there's a backlash against it in some sectors, and you know the return to work mandates from some organisations have been quite brutal, I think, for people who've had a taste of what it can be like to work more flexibly and work remotely and who really enjoyed it. But then, as I said at the beginning, you know, there are people in career stages for whom remote working is really inappropriate. And organizations that are good will manage that stuff really well, and organizations that are rubbish, maybe Amazon, I don't know, because they've just done a big return to work mandate, return to the office mandate. You know, it remains to be seen whether they are going to sort of negatively impact the landscape and encourage other companies to go that way. But if I was out there trying to find a job now, I would be looking very hard at policies around remote work. And I would also want to know the proportion of people in an organization who were working remotely, because it's all very well saying that there's a policy which supports it. It's a very different thing if nobody is doing it, because that means it's not it's not supported. So I think, you know, doing as much due diligence around that kind of thing as possible is a good move if being able to be flexible or remote is important to you. But yeah, I mean, the world of work is a constantly changing and sort of shape-shifting thing. So I think it's really hard to tell. I think the main thing is to start your career having a reasonable grasp of what it is you want from the work that you do, and then looking for an organization that might be able to reflect that. All that said, I must have sent out about 50 applications before I got a job. So I do also accept that at the beginning of your career, you just take what you get. But I think, you know, kind of taking what you can get and then seeing how you could parlay that into another role somewhere else that is more appropriate. You know, I think one has to make compromises at the beginning of your career, and I certainly did, and I wouldn't want to tell anyone that they mustn't do that, because you know, that is it's a sticky bit of your career. But just don't do what I did, which was effectively 12 years in total of just like absolutely grinding without any kind of sense of what I wanted or whether I was doing the right thing for myself.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. I think that's raised some really, really helpful thoughts and things for people to think about. There's a few questions from the audience that I'll start working through. So the
Hit
first
me.
one is around sort of creating a personal brand. It says, is it recommended to create a brand for yourself when freelancing so that you can take on jobs under this brand instead of using your personal name?
I think yes and no. I think that really depends on what you're doing. For a writer, no, definitely not. It's really important if you're doing something like I do, that your brand and your name are the same. Because that's, that's how people recognize me. But I think for many other fields, yes, I think it's a really valuable thing. And I think from a psychological point of view, it creates a degree of distance between you and the work that you do. So yeah, I would say that that's a really good idea. I think when you're devising that brand, and I should say branding is not my specialty, but I think when you're devising that brand, you want to keep it sort of fluidish enough that fluidish, it's not a word, that you can take in other endeavors after the fact. So if I had created a brand for myself at the beginning of my career, it wouldn't have been particularly helpful if it had been, say, super obviously about food, because I've then gone on to do so many other things. And it wouldn't have been super helpful for it to be solely about writing either, because I do broadcast work and I do podcasting and I do copywriting and I do, I work for loads of different organizations. So I think it's helpful to have a name which is kind of catchy but doesn't really say too much exactly about what you do, because I mean, I'm not sure branding experts would totally agree with me here, but I just think the chances are, if you're coming up with something right at the beginning of your career, that that's going to morph and change, because that's the nature of how work is now. Nobody really has a kind of single job for life, or very few people have a single job for life. And so if I was going to put time and effort into creating a brand, I would want that brand to be something that could be quite well, it could encompass a lot of things. I think that would have real value, personally.
Amazing. Thank you for that. We have a question also about kind of a sense of purpose. And it says, when working solo, how do you deal with moments of uncertainty about your purpose? And what strategies help you realign with or change your core motivations?
I mean, I think knowing the core motivations in the first place is a really big part of that. So I think often when we feel like we've lost focus of meaning, it's actually more, or at least this is how it is for me, it's actually more that you didn't quite understand what you perceive as your own personal meaning in the first place. So the moments where I came more adrift were when I had really taken on so I'll try and tell this story without making it a hugely long one. But basically, because I'd grown up in a family where social work was the main job, and everybody in my parents' circle of friends did that kind of work, or probation officers or teachers, or everybody worked in the public sector. I internalized that as that was meaningful work. And so, as I said earlier, when I found myself in my mid-20s working on a food magazine, I was just like, oh, this isn't meaningful work. And it wasn't until much later, when I had kind of somebody I talked to about for the book described it as like peeling back the onion, the layers of meaning that have been placed upon you. It's only when I peeled those away that I was able to discover what looked like meaningful work to me. And that's quite a hard thing to do, and it's quite a lengthy process. I would say it's not a kind of like sit down for an hour in an afternoon and do it. But I think often when you feel like you've kind of unmoored yourself from your sense of purpose, that's what's happened. And in interviews with people subsequently, I think that has been, not 100% confirmed, but a lot of people have mirrored that sort of experience. And also I think it's important to know that not all work is meaningful, nor does it have to be. Some of it's just work, and that's okay. That's fine.
Mm.
There is definitely stuff that I do now that I just do for money. And I think actually allowing yourself to just accept that is fine. Like, your job as a whole does not have to have meaning to you. As long as you find meaning somewhere in your life, you could be a really keen rock climber, and your job could just serve the purpose of allowing you to go rock climbing as much as possible. And that's totally cool. In fact, that's very cool, and maybe also how we should all be living. But you don't actually have to find your work meaningful and purposeful. It's lovely if you do, but also people who work in very that's a Freudian slip, who work in very purpose-driven industries are often the people who are most liable to burnout, and who are most liable to mental health problems, the medical profession being a particularly good example. So it's not necessarily desirable to always want to feel deeply that your work has real meaning and purpose. There's actually a whole chapter in the book about not doing meaningful work, just doing work, and kind of accepting that, you know, certainly early in your career, but I would say all the way through it, you will have periods of time when you are just working because you have to work for for money, for the rent. And that's okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. You know, with that whole find your passion and get someone to pay you for it, I really hate that. Because I often think your passion should be something that you don't do at work. Isn't that nicer to have your passion be something you do on your own terms for yourself without anybody looking over your shoulder and telling you that you know, haven't hit this month's target? Like, wouldn't that be better than taking your passion to work and trying to find someone to pay you for it? Like, I mean, maybe if you're a surfing instructor, it's cool, but even then I bet there are people who are like, oh God, I wish I hadn't made this my job. So, you know, and actually a lot of work isn't something to feel passionate about. You know, a lot of work is like my job as a recipe book writer. It involves a huge amount of washing up. I am not passionate about washing up. I never will be. Nobody will be. Like, and that's fine. That's fine. That's normal. But I don't think that we kind of, you know, we we pedestal work. Like, you're going to find your thing and you're going to do it and it's going to be amazing and you're going to succeed. And actually, that's not what work is. You're more interesting than that. You as an individual are far more interesting and valuable than just the work that you do. So making it the prime function of where your meaning comes from is like, it's a screwed up way of thinking about it. I'm not criticizing the question, but like culturally, I think it's kind of a screwy way to, you know, it's a really good way of getting us to work really, really hard. It's a great bit of capitalism. It's not necessarily good for us.
Hmm. We've got 7 minutes left and a couple more questions coming in, so we might
Yeah,
try
sorry,
and
I'll try and be
combine them in quick
briefer.
fire. No, I think it's really helpful to go into the level of detail you are, but we might quick fire a few. So there's a couple that we can combine. So a question around, sort of a few questions about starting out as a freelancer, really. So, for example, do you need to work at a company for a while before becoming a freelancer, or is that only the case in the journalism sector? But then also, what practical first steps would you take to start making personal connections once you're working remotely or freelancing?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it really depends on who you are, and how you learn best, whether you need to work for a company or not. And I also think it really depends on the field. So I almost feel like there isn't a global answer to that question. So I think, because like for photography, for example, there are almost no photography actual jobs, like to be a photographer. So it'd be very hard to say, oh yes, I think you should go and work for an organization, because the way that most photographers start is as a photographic assistant assisting another freelance photographer, and they're freelance. The assistant is freelance too. So if you're looking to go into an industry where almost everybody is freelance, then no, there's no kind of value in pursuing a job in an organization. But I think if you want to do something, you know, you want to set up your own business doing something very specific, accountancy is the thing that's coming to mind, then I would say that yes, it would be worth, I mean, I think you would have to anyway, but like it would be worth working in an organization for a while in order to kind of look at best practice and to establish a network and all of those sorts of things. So I think you would learn a huge amount from being within for a few years. But yeah, so I think it's highly specific. If I knew what field the questioner wanted to go into, I might I might have a clearer answer. But I also think it depends on how you, how you're going to learn best. And in terms of creating personal connections and networks, I mean, one of the ways is internships and work experience, and depending again on the sector. But that's really valuable. Like most of my connections now in my work stem from one summer interning at the Evening Standard. Like almost everything that I've done subsequently has branched out from that, one way or another. So and I really worked that time. Like I really worked hard to make as many friendships and connections as I possibly could, because and to help every desk that I could possibly help, and to do as many kind of crappy coffee runs and CD sorting and all of those things. Like I knew that if I could kind of, like, without being gross, like ingratiate myself with as many people as possible, then that would be like very helpful in the long term. So I definitely think if you get the opportunity to do those kinds of jobs or internships and things like that, then do them. But like critically, I would say, just be really humble when you do them, because I will never forget the guy who came up to me when he was interning on the desk next to me at the Observer and was like, when am I going to write my first feature? And I was like, mate, I've been here for 3 years and I have never written a feature, so
Gonna be a
like
while.
me first, maybe, please. So yeah, like I think that's also quite, yeah, that's a winning way of making friends. Is like being like, how can I help, what can I do,
Mm.
and not kind of feeling like you're above anything. And then it's just approaching people. Like I get cold approaches all the time from people who are like, could we have a phone call, can you help me, do you have any ideas for or like parents who are like, my kid wants to do blah blah blah, do you, in the media, do you think there's anything they could, and sometimes I can help and sometimes I can't, but I'm never annoyed about being contacted. So I think just reach out as much as possible and just be like, I really respect and admire what you do, whatever the person does, and I just wondered if you had any advice for somebody starting out, or if you know of any internships, or just cast your net as wide as possible, and something will definitely stick if you do that.
It's amazing. I think this might be the last question I'm about to ask. So sorry for everyone who we haven't been able to get to. This is one that I think is quite nice for thinking about when we're working remotely to our own schedules. It says, if you have a schedule for the day, but something throws it out, e.g., a late start, something interrupts you, how do you reprogram your day to avoid that feeling that you've failed or fallen behind?
Yeah, I think that's a really crucial one. I think people are so hard on themselves. Like we all do it, but people are so like inner bully-ish about, whether they're failing or not in their day. And I mean, I think learning to be forgiving of our mistakes and just kind of like, shaking it off, like sometimes in an actual physical way. Like one kind of, and I recognize this feeling. I used to feel it all the time, that I would just, oh God, the whole day is screwed. I might as well just give up. I might as well just give up and lie on the sofa now. There's no point. Um, and I think it's just having the grace to say, I'm human. I've made a mistake, or a mistake has happened to me, but that isn't the end of today. There's another 4 hours left or 6 hours left of it, and I'm going to make the best of what I've got. But just constantly saying, this is what it means to be human. Making mistakes, getting up late, oversleeping, having a hangover, whatever it may be. Like, this is what it means to be human. This is what it's like to live in a human body and have to do a job in order to pay the rent. I cock it up sometimes. I do it really well sometimes. That is what it is like. That is what it's like for absolutely everybody. And it doesn't matter how shiny or glossy somebody's career appears to be, that there will be times, many times, and many moments when they feel exactly the same as you do in that moment. And so it's just about saying, okay, that didn't work out. Damn. But giving yourself the grace to be like, I will start again after lunch. I am going to have a cup of tea and a biscuit. I'm going to go and stand in the sunshine, and I'm going to look at a tree, and I'm going to remember that the world will continue to turn, even though I sent loads of spelling mistakes in that email, whatever it may be. Take a deep breath and carry on. I think, we have to give ourselves the grace when we're on our own and nobody is there to give us a hug and tell us that it's going to be okay. We sort of have to do that for ourselves.
I think have a cup of tea and a biscuit and look outside is probably a nice way to end the
I
conversation.
mean, it's the most crucial advice I probably will ever give you. Like, seriously, it's the best thing that you can do for yourself.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I think on behalf of everyone here, thank you so much today for joining us. I think it's been a really, really insightful conversation. And obviously, we get the sense that you can explore this in so much detail. So
I
the
know,
amount we've
sorry.
managed to get through in an hour
I
is
don't do
amazing.
brevity. I don't do brevity. My apologies.
Amazing. If people want to find out a bit more about what you do and like find out some more about the work you've done in the past, where's the best place for people to reach out to you?
Yeah, so my website is rebeccaseal.co.uk, or I'm mostly on Instagram at bexseal, BEXSEAL. I'm a bit rubbish on all the
Amazing.
other platforms.
That does the job. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Apologies for any questions that we didn't get a chance to get to today. As a reminder, this event has been recorded. If you'd like to listen to anything back, it will be available on our YouTube channel shortly. There are a lot more events coming up throughout the year for our alumni community, including network, online comms, and volunteering opportunities. Just search King's Alumni Events to find out more. Our next event is on Tuesday, the 29th of October. As part of the King's Expert Series, we will be hearing from King's academics in a talk called New Technologies for Mind and Body. Our next how-to event is scheduled for the 5th of December and will be called How to Work in Academia Without Being an Academic, looking at the numerous roles involved in making world-leading research as impactful as possible. Expect more information about that to hit your emails at some point soon. That's it from us. Thank you, Rebecca, so much again for all of your time and all of your
Pleasure.
really helpful information. And thank you to all of you for coming along today. Hope you enjoy the rest of your days. Thanks very much. Bye, everyone.